Welcome to Cow Talks. This is Marcelo Wallau, Forage Extension Specialist with the University of Florida. And this is our podcast, where we dive into the main topics affecting livestock and forage production in the southeastern United States. Join us in this journey as we tackle the main issues affecting our producers and the sustainability of our production systems. Hello and welcome to Cow Talks. This is Marcelo Wallau, Forage Extension Specialist and Associate Program Leader at the University of Florida. This is our podcast where we bring you the most important things surrounding beef cattle and forage industry in the southeastern United States. Today, I have the pleasure to welcome back my colleague and good friend, Chris Prevatt, who is Director for the Alabama Farmers Federation. Welcome, Chris.
Great to be here. Good to have a good conversation about cattle markets today.
You bet. And also another repeated guest in our podcast, Hannah Baker, economist, forages and beef cattle economist with UFIFA's at the Range Cattle Research and Education Center in Ona. Welcome, Hannah.
Thanks, Marcelo. It's good to be back. I'm excited about our conversation today.
Me too. So this is our last episode of the year. And I'm very excited because I was just telling Al that our podcast has reached a huge audience this year. I'm very happy about that. And I appreciate all the listeners that have been supporting us. And one of the things is the quality of the speakers we bring. And I've been here before also to talk about beef cattle economics at some point this year. And we had a very unusual year with very high prices, also very high production cost, inventory going down. We had other things like screwworm, beef cattle import stock, and many things. I hope we can cover a lot of that in our recap for 2025 and then kind of set some perspectives for 2026. Let's start with what happened in the cattle market this year and what has been so unusual from y'all's perspective.
So I guess we can just kind of start with the point you initially made, Marcelo, that this is the lowest inventory of cattle we've seen in over 70 years. So since the 1950s in terms of all cattle, but then since 1961 in terms of just beef cattle in the country. It started declining back in 2019 and then really accelerated with heavy liquidation in 2022 due to just high input cost and widespread drought across the nation. But compared to 2014, just to kind of put into perspective how small we are, we're about 1 million head smaller than we were during the last time we were coming out of a liquidation phase. So just really small, really low supply. We're at the bottom of this current cycle, hopefully looking to stabilize to some point in 2026. We've seen cow slaughter and cow culling kind of slow a lot during this past year. And that's probably due to we've culled everything we've had to cull. And it could be a combination of that with producers are starting to think about not culling as hard and starting to kind of try to rebuild their numbers. So hopefully going into 2026, we're not expecting a big jump in cow numbers when that inventory report comes out, but hopefully not a huge dip or maybe some stabilization there. Another kind of facet of that is the number of replacement heifers that we have is also the smallest we've seen since 1949. So even if we did want to rebuild, tomorrow maybe, we just don't have that bank of heifers to start building from. We've got to start keeping them first, and then we can really start rebuilding with them. And I think that process has started a little bit. Producers are thinking about it across the country, but it has not started, widespread and really significant yet. And then all of that, of course, is going to influence our prices with low supply, and then a consistent demand to keep those cattle going into feedlots because they got to keep up their capacity as well as packing plants. And that's going to drive those prices up. And that's what we've seen over the last year, 2 years, is these record high prices. Just to kind of put some perspective to those, I was looking as of yesterday and comparing like year to year stuff. Prices for a 500 pound to 600 pound steer are still 30% higher than they were last year. Same thing with a 7-8 weight feeder steer, 30% higher. And then fed steers across the 5 area market are about 20% higher. And I'm sure we'll talk about how prices have been affected over the last couple of months with things going on. Those percentages have definitely been higher earlier in the year before the fall season. But the point there is that prices are really elevated compared to a year ago and are expected to kind of stay that way for at least the next year or so.
Very interesting word. The lowest inventory we had in many decades but we stopped now cooling and we're looking into the increase in herd, or at least retaining heifers to increase. I'm assuming what, a 2-year minimum period for us to see some recovery?
Yeah, so any heifers that were held back, let's say some producers are holding them back this fall, they won't get bred till spring of 26, then they're not calving till late 2026, and that calf is not going to enter beef production until 2028, 2029. So yeah, it's going to be a couple more years, even if we have started this fall, before we kind of see
Interesting.
any sort of differences. Yeah.
So you said the bottom of the curve in terms of inventory, peak of the curve in terms of beef cattle prices. But for producers that are curious to see what's going to happen in the next few years, we're not going to see a huge decline in prices, at least not driven by internal market, correct?
Right. Yeah. Based on just basic market fundamentals and where we're at, it is not expected that we're going to see some huge decline in prices, because a lot of producers, I think, get scared because of what happened in 2015, how prices dropped so quickly. But I think that has a lot to do with replacement heifers. What we saw back then, we were already kind of starting to retain and hold back some heifers. So when they were ready to expand, they had the numbers to do it. But this time around, we just think it's going to be a lot slower because of the number of replacement heifers we have, but also due to other things like high input cost, high interest rates, and then, of course, the market uncertainty.
Interesting. Let's shift to the other side of the equation. We talked about the high prices, but we also have very high cost of production nowadays. You mentioned input costs, we mentioned interest rates. Chris, you work with all commodities. What have you seen in terms of prices, and link that with the margin? What are we seeing in terms of actual profit for our beef cattle producers?
On the beef cattle side, I mean, it's been, a very pleasant experience the last 2 years to be in the beef cattle industry. Hannah mentioned just a little bit earlier about like 2020, 2021, 2022, kind of got this thing started, was the culling that occurred in those years just after COVID. So the margins are here now. They weren't there in 2021. I always say that, like, if you look at feeder cattle futures compared to every other commodity in 2021, in terms of agricultural commodities, feeder cattle futures were actually the worst performing commodity of everything. And that's kind of what led to this run up. You had corn, soybeans, wheat, they all doubled in 20 from 2020 to 2022. And on the flip side, cattle were just the opposite. They kind of stabilized, just kind of went sideways for a 2 year period following COVID. Not really much happening. You got the gains that we lost during the COVID crisis back, but it kind of just went sideways. We're in like the 130 to 150 range for a while there, and that's a rough place to be when production costs were going sky high. Now we've worked our way back into a profitable scenario. I include all the costs, so I'm not going to say that that we are in great shape to expand here. I don't necessarily know that expansion is going to be very profitable. What I would say is the profits were made on those heifers that we saved in 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. That's where the profits were in this industry, was taking the risk while you believed in the industry, you believed in your production, in your farm, in your ranch, and you expanded at that time. You expand right now at the highest, heifer prices have ever been. I'm not sure how profitable the heifers that we saved today are going to be. Similar scenario that we saw in 2008, 2009. Go back, compare those to heifers that we saved in 14 and 15. We're in good shape today compared to where we'd be. And Hannah, I'd like to open this up to you as well, but I don't know that we're at the same level of profitability that we were in 2014, because production costs, there's no comparison production costs today versus 2014. Everything's, during the COVID time period, everything doubled. So I think production costs are extremely high, especially when you include all the costs. When you include the cost of your dollars being invested, I'm not talking about opportunity costs on land. I'm talking about actual paying yourself land rent for the assets that you have, the resources that you have invested. I think production costs are very high. $800 to $1,000 a head is kind of where I think production costs are for the cow herd across the Southeast. And that's including everything. That's not just talking about cash costs. That's talking about real cost if we want to talk about running a business. But do I think we're making good money? I do think we're making good money right now. But I think now is the time to kind of shore up some of the things that we have on the farm because we are making margins. But I think it was higher during that 2014 first half of 2015 time period.
Yeah, I definitely agree that profits are good now, but they're when you factor in everything like you're talking about, it's either less, operation by operation basis, less than what it was in 2015, maybe a little higher, but when you take out, high production costs and kind of really compare them to what they were, 10 years ago, yeah, I 100% agree that profits are not what they could be if production costs were not as high as they were.
Yeah. And not looking forward too much because I know we're going to get into that later, but they kind of need to, like, if we go back any on price, we break 300 and start heading south, $300 a hundredweight on feeder cattle. I think it'll pretty much halt expansion. We saw 299. I think it was late November 26th, 27th. Nearby feeder cattle futures hit 299. If we had broken it and didn't rebound like we have $30 a hundredweight, then I think it would hold expansion. I would say any expansion that was going to take place, any of those producers that are out there that were going to be saved back heifers, I would say that they would have started sending them to the feed yard. That's my take on it, just because we have so many producers today that are getting older. They're looking at retirement, they're saying, hey, in 2014, 2015, I said, man, it would have been great if we'd have marketed some more of these cows, got the cow herd smaller, to replace those producers, farmers, that have 80 head, 100 head. I mean, and the big guys would really have to expand because you don't have that many new entrants into the market. So just like stabilizing cow inventories, I mean, it's going to be difficult unless you really maintain these higher prices.
Yeah, and I think we've heard that said, and we've been saying it for the last year that the answer to these high prices is higher prices. We've seen the record high prices for cattle, but obviously those have not been high enough to trigger efforts towards expansion. So I definitely agree with you there that these prices got to stay elevated for any chance of expansion.
Interesting. So we have pretty much two sides of the coin here. The high prices help producers make profit, but also the excessive high prices can result in faster liquidation of that herd, especially from the people that are potentially thinking about the retirement phase or getting out. And when they liquidate, and we don't have a replacement because we don't have buying power for any of those replacements.
It's a tough transition, but I will say, somebody's probably going to get a little bit bigger. In terms of some of those mid-size operators, as more land becomes available, they're probably going to grab up a little bit more land, get a little bit bigger. But it takes time. Hannah was talking about the biology of the cattle earlier. I mean, we're talking about 18 to 24 months when we start thinking about saving these replacement heifers before we get the calf out there to weaning, backgrounding stage. So, I mean, it's all going to take time. I try to when I'm working with producers, don't rush any of this. It's all going to take time. Work through it. And when people start thinking about saving replacement heifers, some of them are thinking about, like, we got to save all the heifers or half the heifers. It's like, save 5%, save 10%, or 5% more than what you were going to. It's like, we don't have to do it all in 1 year.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you start saving heifers, those margins and profitability are if you're pretty much selling everything other than what you need to do to maintain the herd in terms of saving those replacement heifers. When you start saving, 30% heifers and, to really expand, now you're break-even margins. We're not making money because we're saving so many heifers out there that it's just about break even. So you're saying, I want to break even at the top. We have prices we've never even seen before. You're saying, hey, I'm a bet on 2027, 2028, 2029, 2030. I'm a bet on this heifer calving for the next 7 years. That's where I want. So I think it's always good to take some profits, right? We don't want to run a negative cash flow business forever because the money's got to come from somewhere.
Of course. Let me change a little bit of perspective, but within the same topic of replacement heifers and retaining. A lot of what we achieve today in terms of production especially in efficiency of production. So we have the lowest inventory ever, but we have been able to maintain the output. We've been able to maintain production. One of the reasons is because we really improved the herd. If we start saving those, we're going to head backwards because we are not cooling animals, we're saving everything. And that means we're putting in production animals that probably did not deserve to be kept into production. And this was one of the things that we discussed earlier on, Hannah. The main driver of the high prices was that high demand, because if you look into lower inventory but stable productivity, so the supply was stable, the demand was high, and that drove. Are we still seeing that? Is this still the reality here from our last interview?
Yes, absolutely. Consumer demand is, for lack of a better word, incredible, and it's higher than it's been, I think, in like over a decade. But I like the point that you made with supply remaining relatively stable, because over the last, or in 2024, we were feeding cattle a lot longer in these feedlots, so that resulted in heavier carcass weights, which translates to more beef. And so actually in 2024, we were able to maintain beef production compared to 2023. It was actually slightly more than what we produced in 2023 due to those higher and heavier carcass weights. Absolutely. With strong consumer demand, that has really been a key driver of keeping not only cattle prices high, but also elevating beef prices, because we're trying to constantly keep up with what these consumers are demanding. And it's really a testament to producers of how we've adapted over the years and just made improvements in genetics and how we feed cattle and the efficiency of all of those processes of delivering a high quality product that these consumers are willing to pay high dollar for. So that has just been really cool to see over the last year and a half.
And we've said this for the last 30 years now. This is about as big as they gonna get, okay? Unless they start bringing in new breeds, this is as big as they're gonna get, because some of them, whenever you take them to 1,800 pound on these steers, those last few weeks, I mean, they can't make them no bigger.
Yeah, it becomes inefficient.
It becomes inefficient. You start running risk of heart attacks. This is as big as we're going to make them, unless they start, developing. This is the biggest their feet can handle. To be able to maintain all that weight, this is as big as we can make them. We've said it for the last 30 years, but it's got to be true now. I think I said it like 5 years ago. I was like, this is about as big as we're going to take them. They're going to put discounts on them at the packers. Like, these carcasses are too big. Well, during COVID, we said, they're dragging the floor. And what did they do? They lifted the rails. But now, like, it's as big as they can make them now. They can't, like, in terms of efficiency, in terms of just total weight and total volume, I think this is as big as we get. And I'll tell you the other thing, and is one of the reasons they continue to make them bigger is because the price kept looking like it was going to get a little bit better. And whenever you tell me the prices can be higher next month than it is right now, I might feed them for 30 more days. But whenever the price isn't going to be better in 30 days, if we did get a herd expansion, nothing like 2015. I don't even think that's in the realm of possibility. But if you do get a little bit of expansion and it starts going the other way, or you get where, demand, it's been incredible, but if something happened with the U.S. economy and, you have some job losses, actually unemployment just ticked up, I think, when they reported it last week. So, I mean, if you have job losses, you have people that aren't working, that aren't able to maintain higher, plane of beef protein, then, maybe beef prices start falling a little, and maybe they don't want to feed them to next month. Maybe they want to go ahead and kill them now. So many other factors in here. It's also pen space. Like, I've got to replace that pen. Who wants to replace it with a $2,200, 600-pound, 700-pound heifer? Yeah. I don't. So it's just like, I'll feed the ones that I have.
Yeah, you're right. There's just so many ways that this could go, so many factors that influence how long we stay in this period or how quickly it turns. Yeah, your point to the heavier carcass weights, I have also heard that said and have looked at it. I don't know how they can get much bigger than they are. If you look at past, like, historical trends of weights on a linear basis, they've just increased, like you said, over the last 30 years. And there's been divots like when we do enter an expansion phase, for example, or if corn prices drop or or corn prices increase and it doesn't become, cost effective to feed them that long, we'll see those weights come back down. But yeah, I kind of agree. I don't know how we can get heavier than we are, because we're already starting to see from some feedlot guys reporting that these cows are dying because of heart issues. They're just too heavy to get around. And then again, to your point on consumer demand, if these consumers one day walk in the meat counter and say, yeah, I can't do that anymore, that is going to play a major role in prices and demand and all of that. So yeah, for sure.
And then let's talk quickly about beef compared to the other meats. Specifically, like, what do we see in in the meat retail area? You've got beef, which is like people from different across the country probably grew up eating different meat proteins, but mine was primarily beef. I enjoy the taste of beef tremendously higher than we talk about pork. Nothing, love some pork belly, love a pork chop, but maybe once every 2 weeks.
Yeah.
But beef and chicken, that's fine. Chicken wings, a chicken breast every now and then. Everyone loves chicken tenders, but it's just like that is a rarity to me in my diet. But I think the kicker is going to be, and what kind of helps us maintain beef prices is ground beef, because there's so many different ways to utilize it. Spaghetti, tacos, just in terms of just getting those meat proteins in. And I think these consumers will continue to choose ground beef over a lot of these cuts of poultry and pork. And I think that'll help us maintain market share on the beef side of things. And it's becoming like it's a large portion of a fed cattle. It's a large portion of the cutout. And then the other thing is it's not cheap anymore. It's not really cheap, but it goes a long way. Like let's just say it's $7 a pound. If you eat a quarter pound hamburger, it's like, hey, this is actually a pretty cheap meal. Like a quarter pound hamburger if you make it yourself. You slap an American singles on there and a bun, and it was like, we've got like $3.25 in this meal for an individual, and that's super cheap. Go to Zaxby's. I was like, at Zaxby's, it's like $15 for a meal now. I can get a filet for what I can get one single filet. Upper choice, give me an 8-ounce filet. That's $15, $16. That's a meal at Zaxby's. I would rather have my nutrition coming from that 8-ounce filet than having a Zaxby's meal. Just me particularly.
Yeah, I would second that.
No, it's true. I think, and you're preaching to the core here, because we're all very used to that heavy beef diet. But we also see that in terms of national trends, the diets start shifting. We saw a shift towards the higher protein, towards beef protein, which is one of the reasons it has driven the prices up. But now it seems like we've seen that receding a little bit, because the prices are getting to a point where they are close to where the consumers cannot afford. Prices is one of the important influencers of the higher inflation in the consumer side here. And that also triggered some federal government responses in terms of imports. I'd love to hear y'all's perspective on what was going on in the later part of this year with the federal focus on the beef prices, and also with the potential increase in imports at the same time that we have tariffs to reduce imports. Kind of which way we're going here.
I just want one last comment on the consumer. And just like what we just talked about, is the consumer's got to make better choices in terms of their meat proteins. The consumers, we've moved into this, we're going to a restaurant and they're going to cook for us. It's not the food that like we talked about food prices being higher, but it's really at the restaurant side, at a restaurant chain, a fast food chain. That is where prices have really gotten out of hand. You go to the grocery store and like you start dividing some of these, maybe we cut a 16-ounce ribeye in half. You eat the 8-ounce filet. Like, meat's not that expensive, but whenever you start looking at if somebody else is going to prepare it for you, somebody else is going to cook it for you, there's those other aspects of you being served, not having to cook and clean. That's where meat is it's probably got out of hand in terms of some of those prices. You go have a nice steak at a restaurant, it's $50. You go take care of it yourself, it's like you can cook for 3 for $50. So that's kind of where I am on the consumer side. It's just we've got to make better choices. We can't just say, hey, prices are high. Prices of everything are high compared to where we were in 2020. And I think we just have to really just kind of say, hey, things are different. We have to adjust with them. And then hamburgers not really that expensive whenever we ration it, divide it out.
Yeah, I agree.
Chris, I think you can say they're not expensive, but in a big scheme of things, probably not. But when we look into prices that we had a year and a half ago, you mentioned $7.99 for the pound of ground beef, 85.15 ground beef. But if you look into prices that we had a year and a half ago, we're talking about $4.50. That is a significant climb in the cost for the consumers.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is a significant climb. And that's due to, not only inflation, because like Chris said, everything is expensive, everything has risen in cost. But combined with that, we have to remember that we're at the lowest supply combined with the strongest consumer demand. So that, of course, is going to trigger even more what appears as inflation. So combine regular inflation that we're seeing with everything else with market fundamentals, we're going to see higher prices for beef. But again, I just want to make the point, consumers, some people may be balking at the counter, but I know, like, for me personally, kind of to Chris's point, I look at it and I'm like, that's not what it was a year ago, but I'm putting it in my cart anyway because I'm not sacrificing beef in my diet.
Yeah.
We're seeing from a lot of consumers, like, they're making it work because they know that is a sufficient protein source for them and their families. And also comparing to other proteins, like, people aren't really comparing if they want a steak to a chicken breast. Like, if I want a steak, I'm going to go buy a steak. If I want a cheap, quick meal, then maybe I'm comparing ground beef to chicken. But in terms of, like, demand for high cut stuff, that's not really, if somebody wants that, they're gonna buy it because they're in the mood for that. They're preparing for like a special event, but it's hard to do that to compare it to other proteins. So that's why the ground beef market is really important, making sure we're able to keep providing that ground beef product, because like 50%, I think, of our consumer consumption is ground beef. We're a ground beef eating country.
Love it.
Yeah, I think that's what's really caught the attention of consumers, is that high price of ground beef, just because it's in such demand. Yeah.
Interesting. So I would like to hear y'all's opinion about the strategies to potentially control some of the beef prices to the consumers with increasing imports. What has happened? If we can give a quick overview, and also what's the implication of that move to our producers?
Yeah, so I can just say, for lack of a better term, it was a mess, because you can't rush the cattle reproductive system. It's one calf per year, and there's really nothing that you can do to speed that process up. And so therefore, there's nothing you can do to speed up the process of beef production. We're seeing record imports as well as record prices, but we haven't seen beef prices come down, even though we're importing more beef. So more beef imports is not the answer. I'll use Argentina, for example, to talk about trying to increase imports from Argentina. So there was a statement made to increase their tariff rate quota to 80,000 metric tons, which translates to about 176 million pounds of beef that we would import. And on the surface level, that sounds like a lot of beef. But when you put it into perspective of how much beef the U.S. person eats, so the U.S. consumes like 78 million pounds of beef per day, based on what our consumption was last year. When you do the math, that those imports from Argentina, that's like 2 days worth of supply of beef for consumers. And not to mention, the imports from Argentina that we do import already is mainly ground beef. So that's not even really considering high muscle cuts and things like that. So even importing that amount of beef, which also is very unlikely because Argentina eats a lot of beef, so that would either be at the expense of them not being able to eat their own beef. But even if they were to even meet that quota, it really would have little, if any, effect on beef prices, because it's just not even in comparison to how much beef the U.S. consumer eats per day and per year. But that obviously caused a lot of ruckus in the markets, because it was just this big announcement of them trying to fix a market. And any talk about trying to fix or help a market is definitely going to trigger a response from that market. We definitely saw that a few weeks ago. We're still kind of seeing some repercussions from it, but have definitely rebounded a little bit since October.
Yeah, we saw the prices drop. I don't know how much they dropped per hundredweight, but was a significant drop right after the announcement.
Yeah.
On futures, it was $81 a hundredweight from top to bottom.
Mm-hmm.
That's about $650 a head on futures.
That is a huge amount.
Yeah, $57 a hundredweight on the feeder cattle index, $462 a head on 8-weight feeder steers. How I calculate it.
It's interesting how the market reacts because despite the fact that it was not a big impact in terms of actual market, the reaction of
Mm-hmm.
the market dropped significantly. And we're not even talking about the main countries that we import beef, which would be Brazil, Australia, Mexico,
Mm-hmm.
that are the where we're getting most of our lean beef to mix with that fat beef that we produce here.
So, relatively demand constant, good demand for beef protein. Supply relatively no change.
Mm-hmm.
2.2 days, mostly probably frozen cuts of ground beef coming in because it's got to come in from Buenos Aires, Rosario, Argentina. So, I mean, it's got to come a long ways. $57 a hundredweight on feeder cattle index, $462 with no relative important changes in supply and demand.
Yeah.
Man, that just it reminds me of COVID, because I feel it's more fear than anything else, right? I mean, if there was no changes in supply and demand, and you lose $81 a hundredweight on futures, that's just fear in that market. They don't include that in ag economics textbooks whenever you're in undergrad or master's level.
And I hope that serves as a good lesson for our elected officials because they can really cause havoc in the market just by statements that at the end of the day, in terms of practical results, really didn't make a difference in terms of solving the issue that they were trying to tackle. In this case, beef prices to the consumer. It really affected for a short period of time. In this case, which was I'm glad to see that things are recovering, but really affected the cattle prices for our producers without solving any of the problem. So it was
Right. Yeah, that's
completely
the thing.
artificial.
They made a mess and then left us to try and clean it up. Like they didn't help. It didn't help anything. It just kind of confused everybody. And I will say, on top of all that happening, the government was shut down. So there were no market reports being released, which also raises the level of uncertainty. Like, okay, so you're making the statement, but there's no data to like back it up. We have nothing to go on of where we're going from here. So I will just say that October was very interesting. But yeah, things have rebounded. And I'll say in the cash market, I was getting texts from producers at the market, like kind of a week or so later because it trickles from the futures market. But they were like, have you seen prices today? They're like down almost a whole dollar per pound. And I think I wrote down here just for some notes. The week of October, it was like October 25th, we were at $4 a pound for, I think it was like a 5-weight or 6-weight. And then that next week it dropped like $40 per hundredweight in the cash market here in Florida. So, but then like we're back up as of last week to $393 per hundredweight. So just a lot of volatility going on due to a lot of talk and not a lot of results from that talk. So I agree. I'm glad to see things are rebounding. And I hope they continue going that way.
So we've got about half back. We're at
Yeah.
341 on futures this morning. We've gotten half that we lost back in terms of this volatility. I think the other thing that just kind of runs into this is just that the goal was beef prices. Beef prices didn't change at the retail level. It was just cattle prices that changed.
Yep.
In the big scheme of things, I would say that the guy that was buying feeder cattle probably still better off, and the guy that was harvesting the animals really much better off, and then the guy that was selling at the retail still in a really good position. So it really hurt the feeder
The
cattle,
producers
feeder
here.
calf, cow calf producer, stocker operator more than anyone right now, and it was bigger than COVID and the cow that sold Christmas in 2003 case combined. So like you can add those two together, and the drop that we have, the volume of that drop is significantly bigger. We didn't lose $80 a hundredweight in those two instances combined on feeder cattle. So
that is crazy. Let me ask something that though actually was not in our script here in terms of the plan of the conversation, but You mentioned the Packers, and in Chris, we had this conversation a while back that beef prices were high, cattle prices were low. Packers were really making a lot of money in that deal. What's the situation right now for the Packers? Because we've seen some closures of some of the key packing plants in California and elsewhere. We see some reduction in killings. What is the scenario for the Packers, and what does it mean for both ends? So buying from the producers and selling to the retailer.
Yeah. So the closure in California, that was actually it's a relatively small plant, and they actually don't slaughter cattle. They just pack beef.
Okay.
So we're not expecting that to have too much of a large impact on the cattle side of things. But yes, certainly the Tyson, I think it was Tyson closure, and then also the other plant that went from 2 shifts to 1 shift. That obviously is going to have an effect, and obviously signals that we're in that tight supply era, and they're trying to figure out how to maintain capacity to some point and help their margins a little bit. But Packers are still projected to be and have been in the red the last couple of weeks, though, with all this volatility. We've seen them kind of come back in the black as prices for fed cattle dropped and boxed beef prices stayed relatively where they were. We did see them come up a little bit, but overall, on an annual average basis and looking forward, just due to tight supplies and these prices, packers are still expected to kind of be in the red a little bit.
What does it mean to the producers, the Packers being on red? Are they going to stop slaughtering?
No, I don't think they'll stop slaughtering. I mean, we saw the one closure, but no, they won't stop slaughtering because then that puts them out of business. So they're still going to be trying to buy up cattle and maintain capacity as best as they can.
They're gonna be fine. It's a
They
long term.
survived.
It was a
It's a
long term
long-term game.
investment. They still have a lot of plants,
Yeah, I mean,
a lot
they
of
know.
market share. Once you have market share, you're gonna learn how to they're gonna maintain it. I would
Yeah,
not. I would imagine that JBS, Tyson, anytime that they lose a plant in one area, they will likely either expand on their existing plant or pick up another plant that's come on hard times. They have survived for a reason. They're gonna be in the beef industry and meat
yeah.
packing. It's a difficult industry, and they've survived over the long haul. They're good at harvesting animals.
They know there's going to be good and bad years, so they, of course, plan for that. So, yeah, they're going to be fine.
Awesome. I want to transition here. We talked about imports and we talked about inventory. Another thing that to really impact how many beef we have here and how much we're slaughtering is the closure of the border with Mexico. We import a lot of stocker calves from Mexico. We still import beef from them. That didn't change, but we import stocker calves. And the reason was the border closure we had earlier this year for the screwworm. I think that's another huge event that happened this year in the beef cattle industry. And it's not going to affect only the beef cattle, but also other livestock and wildlife. What is the impact that you've seen of the screwworm in terms of cattle production here in the United States?
Yeah, so like you said, we typically import a lot of Mexican cattle. It's usually about 1 million head per year. So obviously that big of a number is going to have an impact on already tight supplies. It's certainly going to help keep prices elevated if we don't have those cattle coming in. It's really affecting a lot of the feedlots down in South Texas and really all of Texas that feed a lot of Mexican cattle. Yeah, I know they're kind of split down there on opening the border back up. Some think it's good to keep it closed. Some want it open back up because, like you said, you mentioned wildlife. We can control kind of how they come over if the screwworm comes over on a cow, but you can't really. It's harder to maintain the crossing of the border on wildlife. So I think there's still a big risk there, but there's been a lot of efforts from the U.S. to kind of keep that at bay. So it's definitely had a big effect. And obviously, going back to the market volatility stuff, the talk of reopening the border and like the uncertainty surrounding that is also affecting how the market's responding. So it's definitely had a big effect.
And Chris and I were talking about this earlier today. I want to make a reference to two episodes that we recorded earlier this year. One with Andrew Schwartz and Ted Burgess from the entomology department here at UF about screwworms, and another with Dr. Dan Kitchen from FDAX about learning more about the screwworm problem, what it is, what's happening, and how to deal with it. Please take a look at those episodes. Very, very interesting. But Chris and I were talking about it earlier today, It's kind of not a problem of if it's coming. I think we dodged the bullet for this year. We're getting into the winter. Normally, winter halts the expansion of the fly. It's much more likely to be when the
Yeah,
screwworm is coming than if it's coming or not. And I think that's a broad opinion from our entomologists and FDAX USDA people.
he froze.
I'll just continue by saying that our position is that just trying to keep the screwworm at bay.
Yeah,
I mean, it's very, very something we haven't seen in since the 1950s, 1960s. For the most part, other than that one case in the Keys of Florida, we want to keep it at bay as long as possible.
yeah,
Maintaining a closed border, just trying to not only protect the beef cattle industry, but also just animals in general, animal agriculture and wildlife in that Southwest U.S. Is very critical and very important. And the longer that we kind of keep it at bay, the better we can get prepared. The better USDA can get compared with the plant that they're building in South Texas to release the sterile screwworms. Very important. And, right there near the border, if we're talking about, it's getting cold now, but, you get in northern Mexico, they're still going to have some screwworm issues even throughout the winter because we don't get below 43 degrees in some of those northern Mexico areas. And even south at the Texas border there, it's still warm. So just keeping it at bay for as long as possible is going to be critical.
Yeah, and it's something that is affecting already the supply, as we mentioned with the cattle imports, but also it's going to affect the bottom line, the cost of production. I grew up with screwworm in southern Brazil. We deal with that every summer. It is a huge toll in our production system in terms of cost of production, time you spend on that, and then loss of animals. One thing that is interesting is now the FDA conditionally approved one new product to work against a New World screwworm. And it's not that we don't have products that work, it's that a lot of the products the companies didn't maintain the label, so they're technically not labeled for screwworms. And another thing, there's going to be a huge learning curve on how to deal with that. So hopefully we can keep it at bay for a little longer and not have that issue this year, I mean, in the coming years, but it will be something that will continue to affect our production in markets.
Yeah. I think another thing, Marcelo, is that I think the latest statistic that I heard out of Central America was about 80% of the fawns are dying to screwworm. Right at the navel after they're born in the Central America area, they're having a major, the impact on wildlife on something that you can't herd and get up and treat and control. It's very serious. I think if we get screwworm in that Texas is kind of where we all think it's going to occur first. We get it in Texas. I mean these producers really are going to have to get on the ball in terms of some management. Those that aren't calving during the wintertime, if you have an outbreak in an area, you got to get these animals up often.
Yep.
And
we're talking about 2 to 3 times a week, easy.
Yeah. So this is a major consideration. That's why we're so gung-ho about let's keep this border closed. Let's get prepared for the situation if it does happen, just to maintain animal agriculture in that area, not just for beef cattle, but for all animal agriculture and for wildlife as well. We don't want to see 80% of our deer population or 80% of the fawns lose a crop or two.
Mm-hmm.
So 2026 coming is right around the corner. We had an unprecedented 2025. What is going to be 2026 in your opinion, in the big picture, and specifically for our producers here in the Southeast? What are your considerations in terms of management and your key takeaways for our producers that are planning 2026 right now? Big questions here.
Yeah, so I think 2026 is still, all things considered, still looking to be a good year for cow-calf producers. We've talked about profits and all of that at the beginning of this episode, how they could be bigger than they are due to high production costs. But I think from a general sense, looking at just cattle prices and where we are in terms of expansion and, not expanding, that it's looking pretty good for the next year, at least in terms of prices. So I think a key thing to remember for producers is that management is still so important, especially since these production costs are higher than they've been in a long time. And so I think just because we're bringing in maybe some more money from, the revenue side, to not, in a sense, get lazy of our management, like still make sure we're on top of things, keeping good and accurate records, and maybe looking at it from a sense of if we do have a little extra money to spend, investing that in maybe some changes we haven't been able to make in the past in order to improve production or maintain it to a certain degree, so that we are more prepared when these cattle prices do kind of start falling off and we head into the next cattle cycle. So I would say that a big takeaway would be that stay on top of management, and maybe even look into investing in some new management practices to stay ahead of this. And Chris, please feel free to add to that.
I mean, I love, one of the things you talk about making those investments,
Mm-hmm.
the point I always hit on, and people don't always like it, is that like every dollar you invest, whenever we say, hey, we've made this much profit, I want to put some of this back into the business. I think this, you said it's got to make a return. Every dollar invest, it's got to return more than a dollar back. So
Mm-hmm.
whenever we go about the end of the year saying, hey, this is what we're going to invest on, it's got to improve livestock production. It's got to generate more revenue. It's not just generate more revenue, it's got to net.
Yeah.
So for every dollar we invest, it's got to return more than a dollar. So whenever we're making these decisions about saving a replacement heifer for the future of our business versus, making an investment in, maybe it's water pipeline, maybe it's in terms of doing some new fencing, investments in terms of infrastructure, barns, or equipment. If we talk about making an investment in a F350 Platinum with a flat steel flatbed, it's got to pay for itself. How is it going to bring in more revenue? It's going to look good at the stockyard, but it's got to bring in more revenue into our operation. That's just something we got to think about. Is it for pleasure or is it for business?
Mm-hmm.
Understand the difference between the two. It's nothing wrong with having that 350 Platinum, but just know that it's for looks. If we're talking about really investing in our cow herd, investing in our our females or bulls. I mean, bulls, the bull prices. We could have a podcast on bull prices. They've got so out of hand. Bull prices and replacement heifers. We could do another 30-minute segment. But just thinking about some of those investments that we're making, I understand we gotta continue to, whenever we select females, select bulls, whether they're going to develop females for us or if we're going to look for carcass. I mean, these investments that we make, they are long-term plays. So got to make good decisions.
Yeah,
Yes, yes, yes.
absolutely.
I like that. I think we cannot get sloppy, we cannot get lazy, and make sure
Mhm.
that we are improving those margins and not only thinking that because prices are good and we're making money now, it's good. Let's go ahead and spend, but we need to be very careful of those margins. I want to ask you something else that we didn't talk about, which is related to interest rates. A lot of our farmers are operating with loans, especially when we think about capital investments. The interest rates have gone super high over the past year. What does that mean for most of our producers? Is this a time that when we're thinking about investing on the farms, Chris, you mentioned improving that production system. Are we going to do that with cash or borrowed money?
I think you should think of it the same. You don't have to. I mean, just think of it the same way. Like my money's as valuable to me as if I had to borrow it. I think of it, invest it the same way. I
Mhm.
can't lose this. I worked hard for it. So I
You
mean,
bet.
but yes, interest rates, they have declined a little bit, and we're going to see probably a little bit of relief. But they're significantly higher than where we saw the last expansion. They're significantly higher than we saw the expansion before the last expansion. So you had a low interest rate environment in 2008, 2009, going into 2010. You had the Great Recession there. You dropped interest rates. That's kind of, we saw a little jump in terms of, and then everything fell off again due to a drought. But so I mean, the last two times you kind of had jumps in terms of cattle inventory, you had really low interest rates. They're not low today. The cost of doing this business is high, and that's why we have to maintain these margins. We want to get paid for what we do. What our producers do and what we do, it's not easy. This is hard work. If we want to get paid for what we do, I think we need 300 plus. It needs to stay at 300 plus for a while, and let's go to 4. You know, If things get really well, let's go to $500 a hundredweight. But we will eventually get there because one, we can continue to devalue the dollar. That's one of the adjust price for inflation, and then we'll probably really talk about where feeder calf prices are. They are better than where they were in 2014 whenever you adjust for inflation. You got to maintain profitability. I would never ask for, someone that is going to an 8 to 5 job and say, hey, you're not going to make any money this year. You're going to go to work, but you're not going to make anything. So, I mean, I think we just have to not produce where we're not profitable. I think 2026 I feel like we could probably going to range sideways for a little while. Hopefully above $300 a hundredweight. But I don't think there's much expansion going to take. I just think it's a difficult environment to expand. It's hard work. I don't think the next generation is as willing to do it as previous generations. I think whenever you get new entrants, they're not going to be as big as those that are exiting. Those farms get divided 2, 3, 4 ways. The really small cow herds, if somebody wanted to, the next generation wanted to maintain, small cow herds are not very efficient in terms of the fixed costs that kind of go with small cow herds. I do think 2026 U.S. economy is kind of like sideways for the most part. I think 27, 28, what do we usually see? The last 2 years of a presidential, of the 4-year cycle, the last 2 years are better than the second year. That's kind of how it's historically played out. I think it'll play out that way again. That's why I'm bullish on 27, 28. I think it'll be better on all the commodities, though. In terms of corn, soybean, cotton's got to get better. Adjusted for inflation, it's like 30 cents a pound. That's my outlook moving forward. But so I'm happy where cattle prices are. I want them to go higher. I'm bullish on them. I love beef.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you said. I like the comparison that 2026 is probably going to go stay sideways. I like that analogy because I agree that 2027, 2028 is maybe even more bullish than next year because we haven't started beef heifers. And then when we do start doing that, that's less cattle entering the supply. And so prices are bound, to jump even more because that's less cattle going into these feed yards combined with hopefully, consistent consumer demand. So I'm with you that I think, we're in good shape for the next 2-3 years. And that would be, I guess, my final remark as well. And I'll second, I love cattle producers, love cattle, and I love beef. So I'm happy for our guys during this time period right now.
This is the right podcast for you.
Yeah.
You bet. Awesome. Hannah, Chris, thanks a lot for the conversation today. It's amazing. We've been here for an hour talking about beef cattle, and we could probably stay talking for another hour here. But I want to wrap up here for our audience. Those that are interested, take a look in our repository of interviews for this semester, for this year. We had some very, very interesting discussion in pretty much all of those topics we brought up today. So if you want to dig deeper, look into some of that material. I appreciate y'all listening to us. And Hannah and Chris, thanks so much for bringing your expertise to this podcast and make this podcast big. My challenge for 2026 is going to double that audience. That's my goal. Appreciate y'all being here today, and I'm looking forward for 2026.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank both of you.
This podcast was brought to you by the University of Florida Forage Team with technical support from the University of Florida College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, Faculty Instructional Resource and Support Team. This episode was produced by Marcelo Wallau, Olivia Mowley, and Ashley Kanabrowski. We hope you have enjoyed this podcast. If you have any comments or thoughts to share with us, please reach out to us through our email, forages@ifas.ufl.edu, and find us on our social media, uf.forages on Instagram, UF Forage Team on Facebook, or UF IFAS Forages on YouTube. We hope to see you in our next episode.